Okay, so this is the top ring, and to prepare the top ring, all we have to do is place the nuts in these pre-prepared holes. And if you've ordered your nuts from Bolt Depot, they'll come in this very nice little bag, pre-labeled, 832. And these are designed to be fairly close fitting so that they don't fall out. And so you may find that you need a little bit of persuasion. So I just use a soft-faced hammer to place these. Just a tap from that. And they'll seat all the way. Before we move on to the next step, we want to go ahead and mark where our electronics box is going to sit. It doesn't really matter where it sits, but we do want to pick a place for it because we'll need that information later on when we go to drill the hole in the bell jar. So all you have to do is pick a hole, and I mark it with a little piece of tape next to it. And then I count 1, 2, 3, and the next one after that, we'll mark that one as well. All right, for this next part, we're going to make use of this cutting mat, which I've placed on the table here, because we need to cut the rubber for the diaphragm. And in the set of models, 3D printing models available for this project, I have this template to cut the rubber. It's designed so that you can place it on the rubber and then cut around it with the scalpel. There's also a hole in the middle that you can use to mark the middle for punching out the hole for the handle. So what I like to do is line this up at the edge and then mark it. Now, you may notice this piece of rubber is much more than I need. So is it worth buying this much? Well, they sell it in 1 foot squares, 1 foot width. And so the minimum you can get is 1 foot by 1 foot. And if you'll notice, if you imagine this was cut in half, you can only get 1 diaphragm out of that. But if you have 2 feet, which is only a few dollars more, you can in theory get up to 4. So I recommend buying the 2 feet and then making as many diaphragms as you can, and then storing the ones you don't need for when these wear out or tear. I'm aligning it with the edge, and I'm going to go ahead and mark the center. Now this is a pen that's intended for marking welding, metal and so forth. It's a welder's pencil, and it does a reasonably good job of making a visible mark there. So if I take this off, you can see that we still have a mark in the center there where we've marked it. Okay, so I'm going to realign that there. And you want to use a very sharp scalpel for this, a fresh blade. So I'm going to hold this down and just cut along the edge of this guide. Again, you want to use a brand new scalpel blade, because that'll be necessary to cut through this rubber. It wants to jump out of the way because it's so stretchy. But using a new scalpel blade will help you overcome that. It may take a couple of turns around to get the whole way through it. Alright, so let's have a look. And it looks like I successfully cut all the way through it. So now we have 1 diaphragm blank, though we still need to punch the hole. One more thing I want to mention in regards to this rubber is when you'll receive it, it'll be covered in like a cornstarch or something. And just give it a good bath in some hot water, kind of rub it against itself, and that'll get used to it. You can still see plenty of it here, these white streaks, but if you get most of it off, you'll be able to work with it more readily. It won't slide around, and you'll be able to mark it clearly with the welding pencil. Okay, so We've cut out our diaphragm, now we need to punch the hole. There's lots of different ways you could do this, but I recommend buying a small punch. This is a 5mm punch. It was $5 on Amazon. Very inexpensive. And again, we'll just align it with the pre-made hole and just give it a good whack with our soft hammer. And we've got a really nice round hole. Now the advantage of having a very round hole is that that's going to be less place for a tear to start. Okay, so now we're going to assemble the diaphragm. I have the diaphragm rubber that we cut out here earlier. You can probably tell I've cleaned it off a bit more. We need this diaphragm rubber. We need our number 10 screw that's 1.25 inches long, a couple of number 10 nuts, and our 3D printed handle. We also need a little bit of thread locker. See what that's for in a moment. And we need some rubber washers. Now the ones I like these are neoprene washers. These are 1.5 inches in diameter. You could probably get 1.25 inches, would probably be fine as well. The key dimension though is the middle dimension. It's 3/16 of an inch, which is just right for this number 10 screw to go through and form a good seal. You get them at Ace Hardware. In the hardware drawers, I'll put an image to the drawer that the label where I got them. You can also get some from Home Depot that are the same dimensions, but they are only 1/16 of an inch thick. So you'd want to get 2 of those. Pardon me, 4 of those rather than just 2 of the extra thick ones. And I'll put an image of the ones from Home Depot as well. Okay, so to begin to assemble this, we first push our screw through our washer, then through the diaphragm, then our second rubber washer, okay, and to tighten it, we just take a screwdriver, hold it still, and you could use a pair of needle nose or whatever. I happen to have a wrench that's more or less the right size here. So we're going to hold this, and I'm turning the screwdriver to tighten this. Okay, that should be tight enough. Now our handle goes on, and then finally, I forgot to mention a washer. I guess you could leave that washer out, but I'm including it. And now we want to put just a drop of this thread locker on. I have blue thread locker. It could be a different type. It could be the red type if you want. That's a bit more permanent. And we just turn this nut on. Now we don't want to just get this nut snug, and the thread locker will take care of the rest. Okay, so there is our diaphragm assembly ready to go. Our next step is going to be to prepare the bell jar. Now, if you don't want to put any of the electronics into the model, and you're not interested in having the valve that you can use to simulate a pneumothorax, then you can skip all this. You don't have to do anything to the bell jar to prepare it. But otherwise, what we're going to want to do is to drill 2 holes in the bell jar. One of them is going to be up here near the neck, and this will be the hole for the pressure sensor port that will sense the pleural cavity, so-called, the space between the bell jar and the balloon. The other port will be closer to the lip, and this will be for the valve that we can use to open and stimulate a pneumothorax. Now, you don't actually need this. You can just loosen the cork, the rubber stopper on the top, and that will allow air in around the balloon. But it might be a bit more dramatic to open a valve on the side to simulate something like a broken rib or perhaps a wound to the thorax. To help us with the process of preparing the bell jar, I've included in the 3D model a couple of drilling guides, and these will help us to accurately drill and tap the bell jar for the 2 ports that we'd want to add. Once these come off the printer, they'll need to be further prepared, and I'll put in a brief explanation of how you need to prepare them. To prepare these drilling guides, we're going to need our drill and die set. You can get this one at Home Depot for about $5. It includes a 1032 tap and a number 21 drill bit. So then you can just take your drill bit, put it into your drill, and what you want to do is just run this drill through the drill guide like that. Do it a few times. I've already done this one, so it was pretty easy, but just go in and out a few times and to get a nice smooth coating in there. And then we're going to take our tap and put it in the drill, and you could use a tap wrench if you have one, but I'm just going to use the drill for this. And you want to make sure your drill is on low speed, and I'm going to go in straight as I can. It should align itself fairly well as you start, but you want to try to make sure you're in as straight as you can. You just start to go in straight. It'll put up a little resistance, so you just back it out. And back out again. And you can see the tap is breaking through on the other side. Okay, so now we have, and I've already done this one, so now we have drill guides that will allow us to bring the drills in at the right angle and also keep the tap aligned as we go through. Okay, once you have the drill guides prepared, we can take the stand. This is also included in the 3D files for this model. But this is nice because it allows us to place the bottom ring in place, and when the time comes to place the diaphragm, we can hold the diaphragm flat in place like that. We're not quite ready for the diaphragm yet. So the first thing we want to do is bring in the bottom ring, put it on the stand, then we can bring in the bell jar, and you want the bell jar to be aligned in the center of the holes that you see here, so that when you put the top ring on, it will be roughly centered within the top ring. It should fall pretty close, even if you don't do anything, but just make sure it's not all pushed to one side and roughly centered within that. Now you want to turn the top ring so that it is aligned, so that the holes in the bottom ring are aligned with those in the top ring. And once we've done that, we can see our two marked holes here, marked with the tape that we used earlier to mark where the electronics box is going to go. So we have 1, 2, and then you just count 2 over. And so now we have these 2 holes, and what we want to do is take our longer screws and place them inside those 2 holes. And once you get one going, you can get the stand out of the way because you don't need it anymore. And just put the 2 longer screws on both sides of that. Okay. And once you get those snug, don't tighten them yet. Now go to the other side and just run a screw in on the other side, and maybe a couple more scattered around. We're just trying to get even pressure on the ring. Okay, so now I'm going to tighten all these and bring you back in for the next step. Alright, so I've tightened all those screws. I have the 2 long ones here and then a few others scattered around just to tighten the ring on there evenly. And now I want to bring in the drilling guide for the valve. Now if you don't ever plan to put the valve on at all, you can skip this step. But even if you plan in the future to put the valve on, but you don't have one yet, or you don't want to do it yet, you can go ahead and drill this hole and then just cap it with one of the nylon screws that I've listed in the bill of materials. Just put a little bit of silicone sealant on the threads of the nylon screw and put it into this hole that we're going to drill and tap, and then you'll be ready if you want to ever want to add the valve. So just go ahead and put the valve drilling guide, and then you can put your couple of nuts on and get them snug. I'm just going to use a pair of needle nose and snug them up here. And now we're ready to drill. Now here are the drill and tap that we're going to use. This is a number 21 drill and a 1032 tap. But it's not a good idea to drill this hole all at once with this drill to start with, because you're likely to cause the plastic to chip out on the other side of the drill. So I bring in a couple of smaller bits. It doesn't really matter what size they are, just a couple of sizes smaller than this final size, just to reduce the strain on the plastic when this big drill bit goes through. But we do want to start with the big drill bit because we want to mark exactly where the hole is going to be. This hole is sized to fit this bit here, and when we put it in with the drill, we're going to turn it, just let it nibble a little bit out on that plastic, and that will mark a place for these smaller drill bits to seat when we use them. I've got my cordless drill here, and I don't know if that'll focus, but I've got it on the higher speed. It's got a 1 and a 2. I've got it switched to 2. I've got the number 21 drill bit loaded in. That's going to focus. There it goes. And now we are ready to go. So we just want to have that go in and nibble a little bit out. And you saw a little bit of plastic start to come through, so we know that's enough. Now I'm going to put the smaller of my 2 pre-drilling bits in. And that should be right where that hole was. Okay. Now the next size up. And finally, the final tap size. So once those holes are done, I can bring my cordless drill back in, switch from high speed to low speed, and load the tap into the drill chuck. And just take this slow and easy. It'll tap through the plastic first. Okay. To prepare to drill the hole for the pressure port, I'm going to take my electronics box and place it in place roughly where the 2 holes that I marked are earlier, just to give me a general guide to where it's going to be. And I want to take a look at this first hole here. That's where I want my pressure port to be aligned. Okay. Now, this is the drill guide for the pressure port. It's designed to go up here against the neck of the bell jar. The bottom of it is curved, and we kind of visually align it with that first hole. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. We just want it to be more or less aligned with that hole. Now this is very slippery. It wants to slide around. So what I did was I took a scrap of my diaphragm material and punched a hole in it with a punch and cleaned it off really well with some alcohol, and that kind of makes it a little sticky. And then I just align the hole there, and I just put it onto the bell jar, again aligned roughly with that hole, and now it's ready to go, and that's going to stay pretty well. Now this is probably going to go out of focus when I drill it, but we'll give it our best shot. So once again, first we start with the full size bit at high speed and just dimple the plastic. Just to get it ready, I'm holding that drill guide quite firmly. Now I'm going to put in the small size. Okay, that drilled all the way through. Now the almost full size here. And once again, the full tap size, which is the number 21 drill bit. Now we once again switch our drill to low speed and load the tap in. And it'll tap through the guide first. Okay, I cleaned all that fluff off, and if you look carefully you can see that's a really nice hole drilled and tapped. I don't see any chips on the opposite side. And if we look at this one, we can see the same. Very nicely made hole. And also importantly, these two holes are indexed in the proper places. Okay, now that we've finished drilling the holes in the bell jar, we can start to assemble it. The first thing I'm going to do is slip the top ring over the bell jar, and I'm going to align the port for the valve in the location it's supposed to go, and that will be 1, 2 away from the hole for the electronics box. And then to sort of fix it in place, I'm going to screw the drill guide, because remember that's threaded on the inside. I'm going to go ahead and use an extra 1032 screw to screw the drill guide into the side port hole, the port for the valve. Alright, so I've got that screwed all the way in, and now I want to align the holes in this drill guide, and again that's 1, 2 over from the screw where the electronics box is going to mount. Now we can take the stand/assembly aid here, put the bottom ring on it, and now place the diaphragm assembly on top of that. Again, the handle is going to go down in the hole in the center of that. And this will hold the diaphragm exactly in the orientation needed for assembly and keep it from sagging while it's being assembled. And what we want to do is, it doesn't really matter which holes you align it with, we want to make sure that these 3 holes, the bolt hole, the hole in the guide here, and the hole in the bottom ring are aligned. Okay, so once I've got the bottom ring the top ring and the drilling guide's holes aligned, I can take one of my longer screws, the 1.5" 832 screws, put a washer on it, a number 8 washer, and then I'm going to use the space below the drill guide here to slide it up through both rings and push it in and screw it in and bring it all the way through that hole, and that will lock the relative orientation of the bell jar and the two rings in the proper place so that the valve will be properly aligned. So I won't make you watch while I do that, but I'm going to go ahead and screw this all the way in there. Okay, so I've got these 2 1.5" screws run through. I did not tighten them though, just get them all the way in, but don't begin to tighten them. We want to be able to tighten the ring in an even pattern, so we're going to get all the screws in first before we start tightening it. Okay, now I'm going to take my other 2 longer screws, the 1.5" screws, and put them into the holes intended for the electronics box. And once I'm done with that, I can remove that blue tape. So I'll just go ahead and do that so I don't forget it. And again, remember to put the washers on before you insert the screws. Okay, I've got the 1.5" screws run into the holes intended for the electronics box. I can remove these pieces of blue tape now. And now all I have to do is put these 1-inch screws in the remaining holes. And again, don't forget to put a washer on first. Again, we are not tightening the screws yet, we're just getting them in place. I've got all the 1-inch screws placed along with the extra long ones, and now I can begin to tighten them. And you want to tighten them sort of like you tighten a car tire when you're changing a tire, kind of go in a star pattern. So pick one, tighten it mostly tight, go to the other side, and then go 9 degrees from that, go 9 degrees from that, kind of just work in a star pattern as you tighten. And what you're trying to do is close this gap completely, but in an even fashion all the way around. Now, once you get all these screws in and you get a couple of them kind of tight, the diaphragm's not going to slip, so you can kind of turn it on its side, and that'll make it a lot easier. And you can see, you can just start tightening. You see how the gap completely closes, and that's how you'll know when it's tight enough. So I'm just kind of going 180 degrees and then 90 and then 180 and then kind of skipping a couple and repeating that pattern until I get them all tightened. And really, after you get maybe half a dozen tightened, you can just look at the gap, and that can tell you where you need to tighten. Okay, I've got them mostly tightened now, so I really don't need to worry about the evenness of it. I can just go around in order and tighten all of them. Okay, so the next step is to install the ports for the pressure sensor and for the valve. And I'm going to put a little bit of silicone sealant on the threads. So I've got the tube here, and this tube is way too big to apply it to these small things. So I'm just going to take a little bit and just put it on this piece of tape. Okay, and once I've got that, I'm going to just use an old paintbrush and put a little bit on the threads here. This is the port for the valve. Now once I've got the silicone on this, one thing you can do to help apply it is to stick this on the end of a syringe, because this should lure lock on the end of a syringe. That's easy enough. It doesn't have to have the lock. If you've got like a 1cc syringe with just the lure fitting, you can just slide it on there. And now this will make it easy for us to screw that into the side. can back it off, and then I give it an extra turn just to make sure it's tight. Okay. And this one's easier to hang on to, so I shouldn't need any sort of syringe or anything like that. And there we go. I'll just give those overnight to dry, and we'll be ready for the next step. Okay, so I've got the port here for the valve, and I've got these two screws installed, so we can take the valve now and just push it on, and it'll kind of turn itself on. That way it'll go on straight. You want to keep it straight up and down. If you have to tighten it more, just grab the stem so it doesn't turn. Now you can leave it like this, put in some normal length screws and just use it as is, but when you go to turn it, you're going to be bending it and folding it down, which eventually is going to break. So I made this little piece that's going to slide in here, and with a couple of nuts and washers that will keep that in place. Now it still bends a little bit, so how do we take care of that? Well, I'm going to take some of this 5-minute epoxy and place it in this little indentation that I've made. Let me use this paintbrush as a pointer. Place it in there, and when I slide this on here, it'll kind of wick up around that base and stay in place. And not only will that keep the valve from folding down, but then when you need to change the diaphragm, you can use this assembly, this guard here, and the valve as a way to align that hole with the rings, just like we used the drilling guide to do that when we were assembling it. Okay, I've mixed some epoxy. I've got it in place. I always wear gloves when I'm using epoxy. And I'm just going to make sure that it's gotten a good bit around. So just to make sure that it's in the right position, I'm going to put these washers on and screw this down. Okay, so that's nice and tight. We'll give that epoxy some time to set, and then we'll have another look at it. So if we take a close look at this here, we can look and see that the epoxy has flowed around both sides of the bottom of this valve. So I don't think we need to add any more. And now this is firmly set in there, so it's not going to flex at all when we turn it when it's installed. And I'll put a picture in of what the epoxy looked like before it was cured, so you'll know about how much to add. Okay, so to begin to assemble the balloon holder, we want to cut off a piece of this polycarbonate tubing that's about 4 3/4 or 5 inches long. It comes in a 2-foot length. Can't get the whole thing in frame at once here. So we're going to have to cut that off. And you can do it any way you want. If you have a chop saw, a hacksaw. I'm just going to use a little handsaw, and I have this vise here. So I've already got it marked off at 4 3/4, and I'm just going to clamp it in this vise and cut it. So I've got this Japanese handsaw. You can use whatever saw you want. This is just one I have laying around. And I've got this thing well clamped, so I'm going to try to cut it as close to 90 degrees as I can. Okay, so that looks like a pretty good cut. It looks pretty smooth. We're going to have to put it into this tubing fitting, and so usually I like to use the factory cut end for the top, and then insert the end I just cut into the tubing ending. That way any unevenness here doesn't really matter. But if it's really uneven, you can just take a file and smooth it out. That should be fine. Okay, so I did end up taking this file and going around the edge of this thing just to make sure there are no burrs on it. So now we are ready to attach the tubing to the barbed fitting. And once again, I'm going to use a little bit of silicone sealant. So I'm just going to use a Q-tip to apply this. Just going to put it on the inside of this fitting here. Alright, that's good enough. And now, again, we're going to put the cut in, and I just cut in there. And this will be a really tight fit, so you're going to have to push hard. And just give it a twist, and that should do it. Just let that dry. Really, you can continue without letting it dry. It'll hold until it dries. Alright, so we need to bore a hole in this rubber stopper, and it needs to be a 1/2 inch OD hole. And this is the cork borer that you can get from McMaster-Carr. It's a brass tube that's sharpened on one end, and it has this plastic handle. And maybe this plastic handle works well for actual corks, but for these rubber ones it doesn't, because I've already been through one of these things, and what happens is as you start to turn it, this handle just breaks out of its little holders and just can't turn it anymore. So we're going to have to modify this to make it into a useful tool to do the job that we need it to do. And we're going to use this steel stick. This is epoxy putty. And what you do is you cut off a length of this and you knead it until it's all one color. And then we're going to reinforce this handle. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is pull this plastic handle off. And I've already loosened it a bit, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But if it is, just give it a good pull and it'll eventually come off like that. All right, so this is garbage. We don't need that. So now we note that there's 2 metal tabs cut out here. And so what we're going to do is take a pair of pliers and fold those down to open them up like that. All right, now that we've opened them up, we can take a nail. Now this is a number 10 nail, and it'll fit right in that little slot, just like that. Okay, so with this nail in that slot, we can then pack that epoxy putty around it and form a handle. So I'm going to get the epoxy putty ready and show you how to mix it up and how we're going to do this. Alright, I put on some gloves to deal with this epoxy putty. I think that's necessary. It comes in this plastic tube, and if you take it out, it's wrapped in plastic and capped at each end with a bit of metal foil. So what I'm going to do is just take a scalpel and cut off a length of it. I'm going to start with a short length here. What is that, 3/4 of an inch or so? Okay. Now we can unwrap the plastic that's around it. And now we're going to knead it. And you just knead it until it's all one color. And that's going to take a while. Alright, so I've kneaded it until it's all one color. You notice it's a dull metallic color. And I'm just going to push it down on top of this, and as I push it down, I'm working it around the 2 sides of the nail, pushing it down into the tube so that the nail gets engaged against the tube on all sides. So that'll be enough for now. We're going to let that set for about an hour, and then we will come back and add some more. Okay, so that's nice and cured. Now I'm going to get some, let's say another inch or so of epoxy putty. Okay, I've kneaded it up. I've got it about as long as these nail here, so I'm just gonna form it into a handle around the nail. There we go. Doesn't look very pretty, but it'll work. So we're going to let that cure now. Alright, so let's now bore the hole. So part of the 3D printing files is this guide that'll help you cut the hole. The rubber stopper fits into one end of it, and on the other side we've got a hole that's precisely sized for the boring tool. Now I went ahead and I took the boring tool and slid it all the way in and then marked with tape when it bottomed out there, so I'll know when I'm finished. Now I'm going to take the rubber stopper and I'm going to put some glycerin on top of it, and that'll help lubricate the cut. Now this is going to require considerable force, so you want to just bear down on it and turn while you're holding the this cutting guide firmly. Okay. Almost cut through my cutting mat there. It may take a little bit of persuasion to get it off of the cutter once you're finished. But you can see there now we've got a nice hole drilled all the way through that. We want to take some alcohol and clean the glycerin off before we proceed. Okay, so to put this on, of course, we've already got the hole drilled through there. You just want to work it onto this tube and push it until you got about 1 3/4 inches, 2 inches above the rubber stopper. Exactly where you end up is going to depend on what sort of balloon you're using, and of course it's easy enough to adjust later. So that should be a pretty decent seal, and it'll help the balloon hold its inflation for a long time while you're demonstrating it to the class. And speaking of the balloon, we can install one now. I recommend you blow it up a couple of times before you use it. That'll help make it easier to inflate once you're using it with the model. Of course, we're just going to slip this over these barbs. Try to get it up there all the way. And what I'm going to do, now you don't absolutely have to do this, but it's going to work a lot better if you enhance the seal here by putting a couple of zip ties that will pinch the balloon up against the grooves in this barb fitting. So we'll do that next. So I've got a couple of zip ties here. I've got a red one. You don't have to use a red one. You can use any color you want. You can get these assortments of small zip ties at various places. I think I got these at a Harbor Freight store. But we're just going to put that on there. And again, you want to get it right in between those grooves. Okay, now to tighten it, you can use a pair of needle nose pliers and a pair of these clippers to hold it straight. I'm going to hold the clippers with a little bit of a gap here and then pull with the needle nose, and that'll get it nice and tight. And then I can cut off the excess. All right. Now the second one, I'm going to offset the clip a little bit. That might help it seal any gap that's around that clip in the twist tie. Oh, I pulled it so hard it broke. So anyway, that's good enough. That's going to hold it in place and give it an extra seal.